Hello. Today's topic is a bit disturbing, but this is, of course, on international security, so we certainly need to give some attention to nuclear deterrence. And we'll begin by looking at this chart, which gives a sense of the rise and decline in the size of the U.S. and Soviet uh, slash Russian nuclear arsenals over time. You can see an enormous buildup in the 1960s, somewhat smaller but less steep, but still very substantial buildup in the 70s and 1980s. Especially the U.S. had a kind of head start, and then you can see the Soviets not only caught up but surpassed in terms of the overall size of their arsenal. And then you'll see a rather steep decline in the late 80s, 90s, 2000s until today. The deployed nuclear weapons on the two countries are much lower than at their peak in the mid to late 80s. You'll also notice here some of the time markers. You'll see the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which put a scare in both countries and helped to lead to a period of arms control. Um, there was the ban on atmospheric nuclear testing, the creation of a hotline between the two leaderships. Then the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968. SALT 1, excuse me, and followed by SALT 2 was the first effort to kind of put a cap on the size of the nuclear arsenals to stop this upward trajectory, which had reached, a stage where it was absolutely out of control in the sense that in order to if one country had wanted to destroy the other country, the size of the arsenals meant that they could do so many times over. And in fact, the number of nuclear weapons were such that if both sides, shut off all their weapons in a kind of nuclear spasm, it could have led to what scientists called nuclear winter, where the amount of particles circulating an enormous cloud enveloping the Earth would have been such that the sun would have, for several years, the sun's rays would not have reached the surface of the Earth, which would have led to massive crop failures and plunging temperatures, and perhaps the end of civilization itself. So, nuclear weapons remain, of course, a major danger, although nuclear winter probably is no longer an immediate threat. You see the Intermediate Nuclear Range Nuclear Force Treaty, which stopped the deployment of shorter range missiles in Europe. Then the 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the follow up a START one agreement, which replaced SALT and began a period of declining numbers. There were several other follow-up agreements, and the most recent being the one called New START. So this is it created the popular impression. The end of the Cold War, combined with the declining size of the nuclear arsenals, has led to a popular sense of complacency about nuclear weapons and about the possibility of nuclear war. But in fact, experts are more worried today than they have been in quite a great many years. And I think today we'll get a sense of why. Of course, the U.S. and Russia are not the only two countries that have nuclear weapons, although their arsenals are much larger than any other countries. You can see France and China both have roughly 300 nuclear weapons. China's may have, if it hasn't surpassed that at this point, it will soon, because China's made a commitment to massively upgrade and expand its nuclear forces. What is the purpose of nuclear weapons? Why do we have these arsenals? Well, the most obvious purpose is to deter a nuclear attack. You're familiar from world politics with the idea of mutual assured destruction, where one country finding itself unable to defend against nuclear weapons, once they're launched, there's not much you can do to stop them. We have anti-ballistic missile systems, very small systems in place, but they are fairly easily evaded in a major strike. So we then rely instead on deterrence, which is the threat of retaliation. And we design our forces, for instance, by putting nuclear weapons in submarines at sea in such a way that they're relatively secure from being taken out by the other side in a first strike, and would be able to retaliate and thus discourage a nuclear attack through the threat of mutual assured destruction. There also are some who believe that nuclear weapons have the ability to make it possible for countries to coerce other countries by threatening nuclear attack. The United States actually has made either explicit or implicit nuclear threats on a number of occasions. Nuclear weapons were actually considered for use during the Korean War, during the Vietnam War. At the time of, we put our nuclear forces on alert at the time of the Yom Kippur War between Israel and its neighbors, Arab neighbors, in 1973. So the prospect of the threat of nuclear war is sometimes seen as a part of an ability to engage in what's called coercive diplomacy. Now, others, and we'll see in a later lecture, that there is some debate over how effective nuclear weapons are against other nuclear powers. Of course, the nuclear arsenals sort of negate one another or neutralize one another. But even when one nuclear power has a superiority over a non-nuclear state, it's hard to find many instances where nuclear weapons have actually successfully been used to coerce other states to make them change their behavior. There's also the possibility of using tactical or battlefield nuclear weapons in the midst of what is otherwise a conventional war. And both NATO and the Warsaw Pact had tactical nuclear weapons deployed in Europe. And tactical nuclear weapons were part of the U.S. strategy, in part because the Soviet Union and its allies had far more troops and weapons. And so should Germany be overrun and it looked like Soviet forces would come to control the continent of Europe, then as a kind of last resort, we held back the possibility of using smaller tactical nuclear weapons, not against Soviet cities, not against Soviet bases back in the homeland, but against massed tanks and troops in Europe itself on the battlefield. There's been a notion that a nuclear war cannot be won and thus should never be fought. But at the same time, there are others who believe that it's possible to fight and win a nuclear war. And usually what they have in mind is not that you would fight and win if both sides use their full arsenals, but that one could use nuclear weapons in a more limited way and hold back others in reserve to discourage the other side from retaliating. So that's a very controversial, argument, but certainly many military planners have tried their best to figure out ways that nuclear weapons could be used to win a nuclear war. One of the ways, of course, you might be able to win a nuclear war is through preemption. In other words, you carry out a successful first strike. The other side is unable to retaliate because you're able either um, to destroy all of their weapons, or to destroy enough that their retaliation is ragged and uncoordinated and small enough that your anti-ballistic missiles can mop up the remaining threat. There's also the idea of escalation dominance. Again, I referred to it earlier, where you you would at some point be able to win by virtue of discouraging the other side from continuing up the ladder of escalation, for fear that there would be too much destruction. Now, there are a number of different postures that in which nuclear weapons are placed. One is launch after impact. In other words, you have your nuclear weapons would be held back. You would absorb a first strike from the enemy, and only then would, after the strike had occurred, would you retaliate. And there you need to have your missiles. If they're land-based, you need to have them in hardened silos. If they're based upon air-based, then you need to have your bombers in the air. If they're submarine-based, you need your submarines out, not sitting in a harbor somewhere, but out in the ocean. The idea of launch after impact is consistent with mutual assured destruction. You want to make sure you have the ability to retaliate, but you're not attempting to initiate or win a nuclear war. Launch on warning is a more forward-leaning strategy, in the sense that you don't wait till the other side's missiles have hit. You launch as soon as a warning of an attack, that attack is in progress. And even for ballistic missiles launched from Russia toward the U.S. or vice versa, or China for that matter, the amount of warning time would only be, a matter of 20 minutes or so, 20, 30 minutes. And so a launch on warning requires the ability to move very rapidly to get your missiles in the air on the way to the target before impact. Now, launch on warning, of course, is very risky because if you have an erroneous warning, then you may start a nuclear war without actually intending to, one that didn't need to take place. And then finally, as we've mentioned, there's preemptive attack, where if you believe the other side is going to attack, or if you even believe that they have a first strike capability, that they have the ability to destroy your nuclear arsenal in a first strike, then of course they might be tempted to do so, and your only resort is use them or lose them. You launch first in order to destroy as many of their weapons as you can, and to limit their retaliatory capacity. And certainly you don't want to wait until they have struck first. So those are three distinct nuclear launch doctrines. Now, how do technologies and doctrines impact which posture a state adopts? Well, nuclear stability, which refers to, a posture where neither side feels an incentive to use nuclear weapons. Nuclear stability has been eroded in recent years by a number of changes. First is the erosion of arms control. You'll see in a moment a chart that shows us how some of the major arms control agreements of the last recent decades have now elapsed, and in fact, or even the U.S. in particular is withdrawn, so that currently there's only one agreement which literally is at the brink of expiration, and the Biden administration has said that they will step in to renew it. It's called the New START Agreement. But had that been allowed to lapse, which it might have if the Trump administration had won a second term, then we would have had literally no controls on either sides, on any country's nuclear forces, and we could have had a renewed arms race, as in fact we already are, but this is at least placing some limits on that arms race. The second change is a shift from mainly a bipolar Russian-American nuclear deterrent. Even though there are other nuclear powers, they're small enough that they aren't considered nearly as dangerous as the two superpowers. But increasingly, we have a multipolar nuclear balance where not only are there more countries, as we've seen, North Korea has developed nuclear weapons within the last 2 decades. Iran has developed some of the capacities to develop a nuclear weapon, and currently, with the absence of the agreement that was reached under the Obama administration, which was discarded by Trump, there's no inhibition on Iran to develop those capacities further. So there has been some expansion in the number of nuclear states, but even more important has been the growth of the future growth of the Chinese arsenal, so that we may have a tripolar, basically nuclear balance, which is in some ways more difficult to manage because you have to get the agreement of 3 countries rather than 2. There's also been the blurring of the distinction between nuclear and conventional weapons, both in the sense that smaller nuclear weapons have been developed, and then also larger conventional weapons. Conventional weapons whose explosive power is in the range of the smaller nuclear weapons. What we've had in the past is what's called a nuclear fire break, where you could have an escalatory ladder of conventional bombs and weapons up to a certain point, but then the gap between the biggest conventional weapon and the smallest nuclear weapon was huge, so that it was called a fire break. Like when you're fighting a forest fire, you cut down trees and brush to remove the fuel, so that once the fire reaches the break, then it can't keep going. Well, the idea was that a conventional war would reach this upper level of conventional weapons, but then the jump to nuclear would be so huge and so destructive that countries would hold back from doing so. But if the gap between the biggest conventional weapons and the smallest nuclear weapons is so slight, then it becomes much more thinkable to shift from conventional to nuclear weapons. So there's been that development. There's also been the movement toward a first strike posture, especially the U.S., but all other countries, Russia and perhaps in the future China as well, building their nuclear arsenals not around purely deterrent strategy, but around the notion of building a capacity to destroy the other side's weapons. And if you are able to destroy the other side's weapons, then you have a potential first strike capacity, and that is dangerous because it gives the other side an incentive to launch on warning or to strike preemptively. So it creates a hair trigger world. Let's look at some of these factors. So this shows us the timing of different major arms control agreements, and you'll see that the only one that remains in place at the moment, as I said, is the New START agreement. The U.S. withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty. We withdrew from the Antiballistic Missile Treaty. And the other treaties expired according to the timeline that was set by the agreement. As I mentioned, China's growth as a nuclear power complicates arms control. It complicates nuclear planning, and it gives an incentive for not only China but the other countries to adapt their strategies to meet a new potential threat. Another looking at the development of conventional weapons that begin to merge into nuclear weapons, we have something called conventional global prompt strike. These are weapons that are able to hit any, they're conventional weapons, but they're able to hit anywhere on Earth within 60 minutes. So they basically are lifted up into the outer atmosphere and then released to glide toward their destination. These are also called hypersonic weapons, and you have boost glide weapons and cruise missiles as well. These can be launched from ground, air, sea, or space. The problem is that it's difficult to distinguish these kinds of conventional weapons, hypersonic conventional weapons, from nuclear weapons. So it appears to be, it can be picked up as and mistaken for a nuclear attack. Also, in the case of boost glide hypersonic weapons, it's difficult to ascertain the target. So, for instance, with nuclear weapons, they're ballistic, and they go up and they basically follow a predictable course. So you can track a ballistic missile, and you can tell where it's going to land, right? And so you know what the target is. But let's say that the United States were to want to target North Korea, for instance, and we launch missiles from the U.S., which would go over the North Pole and cross Soviet territory or Russian territory. You can tell my age. Well, in that case, then you have weapons, conventional weapons that are passing over Russian territory, and Russia would, and that could be set down anywhere. Basically, can be their final destination can be adjusted. And the problem is that Russia won't know whether that conventional. First of all, they don't know whether it's nuclear or conventional. Secondly, they don't know whether its target is really North Korea or whether it's Russia itself, or whether it's China or Russia itself, etc. So we end up creating uncertainty and the possibility of miscalculation. The Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty outlawed U.S. and Russian nuclear weapons with a range of between 500 and 1,000 kilometers. And this was important because these weapons were so close to their targets that they would, there wouldn't be a 30-minute window in order to detect and react. There would be an 8 to 10-minute window. So that would so shorten the response time that it would be impossible to allow for humans to be involved in the retaliatory decisions. In other words, if you have 30 minutes window in which to decide whether there's been if there's a legitimate nuclear attack underway against your country, then you can call the president can give a go order, and you can retaliate, right, through a launch on warning strategy. You could retaliate before those missiles hit their targets. But if you have only 8 or 10 minutes warning, then there's too little time. So what would happen to consult the president or the Soviet premier or whatever? So what would happen is that you'd have computers that would take over, and as soon as they detected any kind of nuclear attack, they would immediately launch. And that, again, heightens the risk of inadvertent warfare because the computers may be mistaken. So why did well, why did the U.S. then withdraw from this treaty in 2019? First, because we believed that Russia was cheating on the agreement. That was, in some sense, though, a kind of excuse because the real reason is that China was not bound by this agreement. They were not party to it. And China was developing intermediate nuclear force weapons. And we wanted the ability to develop weapons in the same classification so as to respond to China. So that was the main reason. But again, it is creating, in the process of creating, a more dangerous nuclear balance. We've also had an increase in the arsenal of smaller tactical nuclear weapons. They make nuclear weapons more usable. The Soviets have even developed nuclear torpedoes, including a torpedo that can travel across the entire Atlantic. So it raises the risk of incremental escalation. Now, we've also seen the United States and perhaps Russia and China move toward elements of a first strike strategy. So we often think that, well, we're taught in school, like courses like mine, that the U.S. strategy is mutual assured destruction, right? Nuclear deterrence, but that's in fact not the case. We're constantly planning toward a more aggressive first strike posture. So one way in which we do that is by destroying command and control systems, so that the other side is their leadership is dead, their systems for communicating with their missiles or their submarines are dismantled, and therefore they're unable to retaliate. We do this through anti-satellite weapons, so that we can take out satellites that are used in military communication systems, especially for communicating with submarines. We have cyber offensive weapons that are designed to take down the other side's communication networks. And then, of course, nuclear or conventional strikes that kill the other side's leadership. So that's decapitation. Another element of first strike strategy is to develop warheads. Again, there's a missile is the delivery vehicle. The warhead is the actual bomb. You want warheads, missiles and warheads that are accurate enough that they're capable of destroying ICBMs, bombers on airfields, and submarines in port. In the case of Russia, unlike the U.S., Russia depends very heavily upon land-based missiles. And there you need to have a warhead that goes off in a precise enough fashion that it creates sufficient pressure to destroy a hardened bunker. They're underground, they're covered by cement, and you have to create sufficient pressure to break through and destroy the weapon. So that requires accuracy. If you just wanted to deter, you don't need accurate or precise weapons, because it doesn't take precision to destroy, St. Petersburg or Moscow, or Beijing for that matter. But if you want to try to destroy the other side's weapons before they've had a chance to launch them, then you can use, you need precision. And then you need anti-ballistic missile systems that try to basically shoot down the opposing country's missiles while they are en route to their targets in your country. So the U.S., by withdrawing from the anti-ballistic missiles treaty, made it possible for it to develop a more extensive anti-ballistic missile systems. So the U.S. has an arsenal of land-based U.S. Minuteman III missiles, which are only first strike weapons. um, they, well, they themselves are vulnerable to a first strike. So if the other side struck, launched missiles, and we had a launch on impact policy, then those missiles would be destroyed in their silos, just as today, Russian missiles in their silos are also vulnerable. So we basically have no choice but to launch on warning with respect to these Minuteman missiles, or to use them for preemptive. That's why they're always kept on high alert status. Having these missiles means that we are always in a hair trigger system. That's not true, for instance, of submarine missiles where we have more latitude. Now, with regard to submarines, in the past we've had the Minuteman III are capable of taking out Russian hardened missiles in hardened silos, but there aren't enough of them to take out the entire Russian arsenal. So what has happened more recently is that we've developed Superfuse, which is a way of more precisely targeting the warheads, such that with enhanced precision, one warhead is able to take out a hardened Russian silo, and that means that the U.S. now actually has so many submarine launch missiles or warheads that we're able to target each Russian silo with 3 weapons. That's certainly more than enough to take out all of the Soviet missiles in their silos. And the problem is that you say, well, that's not a first strike capability because the Soviets would simply launch on warning, right? Well, actually, the Soviet satellite system that it uses to detect a nuclear attack has degraded, and such that they now have no satellite warning system. After the end of the Cold War, their military spending went down. They were unable to maintain those satellites. So now they rely solely on radar, which means that, one, radar is much less reliable and thus more dangerous, but also that Russia would have radar that gives them far less warning. So if you take those into account, that the combination of U.S. Superfuse Trident warheads, missiles and warheads launched from submarines, combined with our Minuteman III, we have the ability basically to plus decapitation and the short warning time that the Russian military would have. All that together means that we basically have close to a first strike capacity versus the Russians. They still have some submarine launch weapons, but their submarine fleet is also under-maintained, and most of their submarines are in port at any given time. We also, if the Russians did have the ability to, did have some weapons that survived and were able to strike back, then the U.S. could use our anti-ballistic missile system, which we've now announced. Before we said, well, we're only building a system capable of stopping attacks from small nuclear powers like North Korea or potentially Iran. But now we've said we're building out a system that's capable of dealing with Russian or Chinese nuclear attack. So the combination of all these things means that the U.S. is adopting what's close to a first strike posture. And the problem is that a first strike capability you don't want, because you basically, the other side then believes that they will be destroyed unless they strike first. And they know that you know that, and therefore, the U.S. has once we have a first strike capability, we have a strong incentive to use it, because if we wait too late, then the other side can preempt, and that's the only way that they would be able to have any chance in a future war. So having a first strike capability may sound cool, but it's really dangerous, not only for the side that faces that risk, but even the side that has the first strike capability. All right, so that's nuclear weapons and deterrence. Thanks, guys.